Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA. With me, Al Murray. Yeah, absolutely. Here we go. With me, Al Murray, and James Holland. And we are, for these American editions, for this series, for this open-ended season, who are we joined by, Jim?
Well, I mean, he's joining us a little bit late in the whole procedure, isn't he? About kind of 2.5 years in. It is, of course, the brilliant. I know, but it was just too obvious. It was too easy. We're joined by the brilliant friend of the show, friend of both of us, John McManus and John Willkommen.
Yes, welcome aboard, John.
Well, thanks. I'm late for everything. I know. So it's just great to be a part of this with you guys. Thanks so much for doing it.
Now, we thought to get started, we'd talk about the Gaijin shogun himself, Dugout Doug, the big chief. And in fact, someone that we've touched on along the way in the We Have Ways of Making You Talk, the British edition of this podcast, but have never actually got to grips with properly, which is, of course, Douglas MacArthur, who's probably the biggest figure in the US war effort, full stop, arguably, certainly within the services. Is that a good opening contention?
Well, in the Pacific, absolutely. And he would have thought of himself as like the Zeus of the theater. So here is, I think this is the place to start with MacArthur, who's, I often say, on a good day, his ego might have fit inside the Grand Canyon, maybe, possibly. So this is what you guys, I think, will find this interesting. This is what his British liaison officer, who was attached to SWAPA, Southwest Pacific Area Headquarters, this is what he wrote about him, I think quite insightfully. And he said, he is shrewd, selfish, proud, remote, highly strung, and vastly vain. He has imagination, self-confidence, physical courage, and charm, but no humor about himself, no regard for truth, and is unaware of these defects. He mistakes his emotions and ambitions for principles. With moral depth, he would be a great man. As it is, he's a near miss, which may be worse than a mile. His main ambition would be to end the war as a Pan-American hero in the form of Generalissimo of the Pacific theaters. And I just think I've never heard like a succinct synopsis of MacArthur better written or spoken than that. That's just brilliant, I think.
But John, I mean, he's a massive name even before World War II breaks out, isn't he? I mean, he's been the chief of staff. He's a huge figure already. He's kind of very wedded to the Philippines, of course, which is a kind of an outpost of the USA in the 1920s and 30s. He's not a shrinking violet before the war begins.
Oh, absolutely. And that is the thing that's unique about him versus any other theater commander. He was once chief of staff of the U.S. Army. And so how does this happen? Well, he was young as Army chief of staff. He was in his early 50s. So when he retires, basically in the mid-1930s, he's invited to the Philippines, which Congress in 1934 had passed an act saying, we're going to give the Philippines its independence in 1946. So MacArthur's invited there by his old friend Manuel Quezon to basically stand up the armed forces for what's going to be a new country. And so he's like this field marshal of the Philippines, but it's a very hollow army. Think of it this way. This is an archipelago with 17,000 islands. You've got incredible diversity of cultures, amazing, of languages, all of this stuff. So imagine, the army is like a National Guard style army that he's setting up. So think if you've got a local unit, a platoon of about 40 guys, say, you might have 5 or 6 languages represented in that platoon. How in the world can you organize anything that way, much less the weaponry problem and equipment problem? So MacArthur's been working on this in the late 30s.
Sounds a bit like the Indian Army, to be honest. But John, just to sort of go back a little bit, I mean, it becomes American right at the end of the 19th century or beginning of the 20th century. I can't quite remember right. But doesn't MacArthur go over and join his old man? Isn't his father over in the Philippines? Or have I got that
exactly,
wrong?
Yes.
And they're kind of cut from the same
right.
cloth, because he was pretty arrogant too, wasn't he?
He was, but no one was in Douglas's category in that regard. I mean, he went way beyond his dad. Yeah, the interesting thing is that, the American presence of the Philippines is an offshoot of the Spanish-American War in 1898, because Spain had controlled the Philippines as a colony for hundreds of years. And of course, the Filipinos were restive, especially the Tagalog speakers on Luzon, who were really the elite of the country.
And Luzon
they wanted their independence.
And Luzon is the island on which Manila sits, isn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Often called the main island, though I'm sure others would, throughout the archipelago would dissent from that. But it is the dominant island is maybe the way to say it. And so the Americans are there working with them against the Spanish in 1898. But it's very uncomfortable because on the horizon is, well, will the Americans give us our independence? So President McKinley at that point makes what I would argue is one of the most fateful decisions in American military history, in that he decides to remain there as basically a colonial overseer, which then initiates the Philippine-American War. Americans often call this, I got to say this, Americans often call it the Philippine insurrection. I mean, what do you think about when you think of an insurrection? What is that?
Well, yes, that's Star Wars. It's an uprising against an evil empire, isn't it?
It's a rebellion, right? It's a rebellion,
exactly,
against some sort of internal rebellion. Well, the Philippines, then that presupposes the Philippines are somehow America's, So I often call it the Philippine-American War, and it's actually quite interesting on a lot of levels, but it's a counterinsurgent war. And contrary to, I think, a lot of popular belief in which the idea is, well, insurgencies always prevail, actually they don't. And this one didn't. And the Americans ultimately gained colonial control. So MacArthur's father, Arthur, who was a Civil War hero who had earned a Medal of Honor for bravery in the Civil War.
I mean, that in itself is amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's incredible.
Oh, it is. And the battle that he's part of for this, the Missionary Ridge battle, is just incredible in 1863. And so Arthur MacArthur is really fascinating on a lot of levels. And so here he is 30 some odd years later as a general, as the American commander in the Philippines. And so right there, you see this very powerful bond established between the MacArthur family and the people of the Philippines. Douglas graduates West Point in 1903. His father was not a West Pointer. Douglas graduates in 1903. And yes, his first posting is the Philippines as an engineer officer. And it's one of many tours he will serve. And he becomes just, of course, a great friend of the Philippines and has a bond. And he really kind of thinks of it as home by the late 1930s, because it has been.
Yeah.
So the war is very personal to him in the Philippines.
So Quezon appointing him, they're friends, aren't they? They're pals. It's who would get the job, isn't it? It's not a question of him being shuttled off there by the American military establishment to get him out of people's hair. Because after all, getting in people's hair is part of his speciality.
It is. I know.
Isn't it?
It is. Well, part of it is getting rid of him in the sense of, Roosevelt, he did not get along very well with President Roosevelt when he was Army Chief of Staff. So they were happy to see him go to the Philippines. If they'd really want him to continue in Washington, they probably would have made that happen. Yeah. So they're kind of just happy to move him over onto the margins there to oversee what is, I won't say a hopeless job, but it really difficult, because basically the U.S. Congress isn't even willing to arm its own formations properly in the late 1930s, much less Filipinos, who might eventually turn those guns on the Americans before we would want them to, and if you didn't get the independence before they wanted. So MacArthur's dealing with a really difficult job by the end of the 30s.
But the point is, he's already at retirement age. This is a kind of sort of post-retirement.
Yes, he's old, isn't he?
He's left the army. He's got his management consultancy role with McKinsey's or whatever. I mean, that's the sort of equivalent. I mean, let's not forget he graduates out of West Point in 1903. His dad's in the freaking Civil War. I mean, he's a notch older than all the other senior commanders of World War II.
Oh, he definitely is. Yeah, he's already been through his career, and he had served in World War I, as in the 42nd Division as a brigade commander, as division chief of staff, had this very valorous kind of career there. He had been superintendent at West Point at a very young age of 39. Yeah, he'd kind of had his career. So he's going to be age 60 in 1940. And, certainly that's older than eventually most of his peers are going to be. So he's recalled to active duty in the summer of 1941 when, war with Japan is obviously imminent. But even then, he's presiding over what I would argue is a unique army in American history. It's a colonial style army, almost in the British model, because it's mostly locals.
And the problem is when you have a kind of a colonial style army, which is there primarily to do kind of policing and, keep the order and all the rest of it, which is absolutely the case with the kind of British colonial forces in, say, Malaya or Singapore. It tends not to go terribly well when you come up against troops who know what they're doing. And of course, that's pretty much exactly what happens, isn't it?
And John, what's his relationship with Marshall like at the point where he has to be sort of reactivated? Because after all, he's been superseded by people who he's had disagreements with and who've replaced him in his generation, essentially, because a generational handover occurs with Marshall, and Marshall bringing his people in, bringing his crew in with him in 1939. What's his relationship with Marshall like? Is Marshall reactivating MacArthur with a heavy heart or out of sheer necessity,
that's a really good point.
or actually he's the best guy, he's the guy on the ground, we'll have to go with him?
Well, MacArthur was succeeded by Malin Craig initially, and he was okay with that, got along fine. But if you were to ask MacArthur in 1939, and you'd say, who is the last officer you want appointed to be Army Chief of Staff, I'd be willing to bet George Marshall would either be the choice or certainly on the list, because they had a checkered past. When MacArthur was Chief of Staff, he had tried to basically demolish and destroy Marshall's career by moving him as a lieutenant colonel to a National Guard unit, which would have been thought of as a dead end in those days. And fortunately for MacArthur, Marshall was not the vindictive type. So once he comes Chief of Staff, he knows that he's going to need MacArthur in the event of war. But it's really interesting when you look at a lot of Marshall's communications with his various theaters commanders during World War II. He deals with MacArthur quite differently than he does with the others, many of whom, like you said, Al, had been proteges, like most notably Eisenhower, of course. He deals with MacArthur on a kind of wary, sort of equal level, while also trying to kind of stave off MacArthur's worst excesses. And in the course of the war, not Marshall, but MacArthur is often very paranoid about Marshall sabotaging him. And he really, MacArthur often in the course of the war unburdened himself with Robert Eichelberger, who's really his finest ground commander. And he would tell him, this is the workings of George Catless Marshall, and, sabotaging us and doing this and that and the other thing, and other men in Washington, D.C. And it was really very revealing on how MacArthur viewed Marshall, too.
But John, I mean, just on MacArthur, I mean, and his character and stuff. I mean, we know he's vain and all those kind of things, but he's also a modernist, isn't he? I mean, he goes around in aviator shades. He looks up to date with his kit and the way he wears his cap, and embraces modern technology and all that kind of stuff. He's well read, isn't he? He's got this library and this apartment at the top of the hotel that he lives in Manila, and so he's kind of well read, isn't he? Or is that all a bit kind of pretentious? Or is that for show? It's not for show. He genuinely is. I mean, he's a bright guy, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. I mean, I think that by any measure, he's intellectually brilliant. And so, yes, that makes him well read. It makes him a deep thinker on a lot of levels. Certainly, he has much to recommend in terms of his strategic acumen and all that. When we're talking about the early stage of the war, he's in a learning environment. The training wheels are on in a way, because he's not working well with his naval and air commanders, and yet later in the war he will. Part of it is personalities. It's whether somebody can deal with MacArthur and vice versa. So the example I like to give, and it's a really fascinating insight, I think. The guy who commanded the naval forces in the Philippines in 1941 and 42, kind of alongside MacArthur didn't necessarily control him, was Admiral Tommy Hart. And he doesn't have much of a fleet, but it could be sort of potent against the Japanese at times. But the dynamic there that I think is sometimes overlooked, MacArthur had actually an older brother who was a naval officer who was also had a kind of rocketing career. And he dies in 1921 of appendicitis, of all things. Just mind-blowing, that this could happen. I think he was a commander or a captain at that point. And he had been friends with Hart. And so to Hart, MacArthur was, just sort of his buddy's, full of it younger brother. And so there was always that kind of weird dynamic there. And so MacArthur came to feel that Hart and the Navy had kind of betrayed him in the Philippines in 1942, which I think is unfair, but that's how he viewed it. And so he has very difficult relations with the Navy until he meets Halsey, Admiral Halsey. And by the way, speaking of fathers, their fathers had known each other because Halsey was another military legacy. Right. Which was a tendency of a lot of these guys.
But these two get on, don't they? Halsey and MacArthur kind of mutual respect, and that's the kind of the marriage that works.
I mean, this is striking. Yeah. It's striking, though, John, about how small the American military establishment seems to be in lots of ways. That you know, we think of America, you know, from here, from the UK perspective, we think of America as a large country with, you know, with all sorts of different centres to it and all this sort of stuff, and Britain is the little country where everyone's connected to everyone else and everyone's married to everyone else and they all went to school together. But the notion that, you know, people's brothers and fathers figure in how the interpersonal relationships work at the highest level in American command, it's very interesting. It's revealing and a surprise to the uninitiated, perhaps.
Yeah, it is revealing, and what it shows you is at that point in American history, what was called the military professionals or whatever is kind of open to just one sort of person, and that's white guys. And so you've got a smallness to it in that respect. You also have just a physical smallness to it in that most of the time, U.S. military hadn't been very large or well funded. Civil War and World War I notwithstanding. So what I often say, especially about the Army in World War II, it was large enough to have a cadre of really good military professionals to help win the war, but not so large as to be just sort of racked by careerism and careerists. You know, so yeah, I mean, it is. It's a very intimate kind of setting. And when you think about Halsey and MacArthur, you know, I mean, they are coming from this military legacy.
And was it respectable to be socially respectable to join the services? Because in Britain, you know, being an officer is sort of second son stuff, isn't it, Jim?
Third son priest, second son military, first son runs the estate.
Yeah, whatever it is, yeah. But it's socially respectable. You know, the social structure in London, very much, especially the Navy, it's extremely respectable. Is it respectable, or is it a sort of thing people, kind of odd people do, if you see what I mean?
Yeah. Is it something that's lost prestige in the years of isolationism and the kind of reducing the army and post First World War and all the rest of it?
In that era, the 20s and 30s, it's not very respectable. And in the kind of elitist circles in which you would have run, and the kind of people you might have encountered as an Army officer, most of them would have been like, what are you doing there? You could be on Wall Street, or you could be in a law firm somewhere, or you could be running a company, or you're doing something other than this. And so it's really interesting. And at various times in American history, it just kind of depends when we're looking at it in terms of the attitude of people towards soldiering. Sometimes way off the scale, like Civil War or World War II or something. And other times it's, you know, very much looked down upon, like the isolationist period, but also the post-Vietnam period too, in which a 1973 Harris poll revealed that that military personnel were viewed only above garbage collectors in terms of public esteem. You know, at that point.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, isn't that mind blowing? It's like,
yeah, isn't it? But listen, this is one of the things that I'm thinking about. You know, MacArthur is this kind of almost has been in 1941. You know, he's retired as chief of staff. He should have been put out to graze. You know, in that way, he's kind of a bit like Wavell. Wavell's retired and wants to be a Cambridge academic and a Cambridge don, and then gets pulled back. Or he's a bit like Tiny Ironside in that, you know, Tiny Ironside is the chief of the Imperial General Staff at the start of the war, but then gets sidelined, you know, very, very quickly, because he's one of the guys that, you know, those people that are kind of running the show at the start tend to kind of get kicked out pretty quickly. And yet MacArthur, despite his age, despite the fact that he's already kind of, you know, past retirement age, becomes this mega figure at a time when every other comparison I can think of is actually falling by the wayside. And you've got the point that you know, he's grown up yeah, exactly. And he's grown up in the kind of, you know, he's earned his spurs in the noughties of the 20th century, and then the First World War, and then the 20s and 30s. So he's kind of behind the times in terms of, modern warfare, technology, air, land, sea integration, all those kind of things. And obviously the fall of the Philippines is a complete catastrophe. Lots of Americans get killed. It's a humiliation. The Bataan Death March, Corregidor, etc., etc. And yet he comes out with his reputation enhanced. And that's quite an achievement, isn't it? Compared to literally
it's incredible.
Everyone else in his situation.
Yeah.
You'd have thought that would be it.
He's because there's two sides to this of why this happens. And what I think is so funny about it, MacArthur constantly portrayed himself as the outsider. There were always people in Washington plotting against him or, whatever it would be. But actually, when you really look at his life and career, he's the ultimate insider. Obviously, being the son of a general certainly gives you a head start. His mother, though, is one of the key players, especially after the untimely death of his father and after his brother's death. His mother is constantly working the army hierarchy for the betterment of Doug's career. I mean, I found letters, like to Pershing and all this kind of stuff. And so he's got that going for him. And he's also very media savvy at a time when that's becoming really important. And so MacArthur understands a lot about image and what I would say cult of personality. And that, more than anything, is what saves him.
But where does that come from? Because he's stuck in the Philippines. I mean, where's that coming from?
Yeah, but that's the central part. That's the central part of the American, activity or story in the early part of World War II. I mean, Europe first may be the policy, but that's got to take a long time to amp up, and it's hard to wrap your mind around the U-boat war that's going on at that point beyond just the headlines you would read, especially if you're a Midwesterner. How are you going to care about what's going on at Cape Hatteras with the U-boat sinkings or something? So in MacArthur's case, and this is another very American tendency, the American people needed a hero, and he's willing to be that hero through the cultivation. Because of his egomania that I alluded to earlier, he's very comfortable with the idea of all his communiques, any story coming out of his command centering around him. And that becomes the sort of hook around which is built this idea that he's just doing an amazing thing. There's one of the things, the myths that also comes out of the Philippines campaign, that the Phil-American forces are just vastly outnumbered and overwhelmed. Actually, they outnumbered the Japanese about 2-1. So that whole thing is just absolutely absurd. Now, they don't control the air and the sea, and obviously that matters a lot, but they had some things going for them, and it's a monumentally screwed up campaign by MacArthur on a lot of levels, but he's able to kind of cultivate a different image. So I think that's really where it comes from.
Let's just hold that thought. We'll go for a very quick break. Welcome back to Weird Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, Al Murray, James Holland, and John McManus. And Jim, you were just about to leap in there.
And it's going to be a gem.
Well, I've got two thoughts. My first thought is I don't think we're going to cover MacArthur in one episode, and I think this might have to extend it to two. We'll leave it. We'll leave him. So the first one is the kind of sort of gets to Australia. The second one is the fight back. But my point was going to be is that on one level, he's kind of behind the times. He's kind of, he's a has-been. He's already been chief of staff, all the rest of it. He's come on and he's made a hash of things in when the Japanese attack. But he obviously learns pretty quickly, and this is one of the things I think is remarkable. And in sharp contrast to those senior commanders in, let's say, the French army, for example, in 1940, who don't learn quick enough. For someone his age, he actually embraces modernity and technology very, very quickly. And boy, does he get his act together. And that I think is remarkable, because if he was really bad as a general, he wouldn't have survived, despite his ego, despite his connections, despite his mum writing letters.
He probably wouldn't have, because he would have suffered more defeats, because he would have kept screwing up in the same way. Now, I think it's a good point, James, because it's like, and I think that the best way to sort of get a lens into that is he's open-minded enough to really start thinking about the modernity and through air and sea power. And so when he starts to have this rapport with Halsey, it makes him understand just how important sea power is going to be for everything he wants to do, which is, of course, to get back to the Philippines. He's had a problematic relationship with Louis Brereton, who, of course, will be around a long time in World War II and a lot of different places, and George Brett. And he's thought the Army Air Forces are useless initially, but once George Kenny comes into play, Kenny makes him see the importance of air power. And so you're right, Jim. He has this kind of flexibility.
He is open-minded.
Oh, he's open-minded in that respect, yeah, and he will adjust. And I think that is one of his better qualities.
But John, I mean, the U.S. Army is renowned for firing people.
At that time,
hire and fire is part of the way things get done. You know, if you screw up, you go home. He doesn't. How is he able to basically avoid that?
I think it's because in part because he's been chief of staff and there's a different dynamic there. Marshall knows that firing him is going to be very different than firing your average commander because he's been at that high level, because he has this now political following that eventuates from that cult of personality. There are guys there's in the spring of 42. There are people renaming, parks after him, post offices. People are naming their kids Douglas MacArthur or something. And so if he's
listen, I was in Washington, D.C. last week, the end of last week, and I went down MacArthur Drive or something, someplace that had been renamed after Douglas MacArthur.
And it's probably a legacy of that time, I would guess. I don't know, wherever you were, because, and so this is a political component that's going to have blowback against the Roosevelt government, especially because most of the sort of political cult of personality around him tends to be from the right, from the Republican side, from the pro-China lobby, the pro-Asia, sort of anti-Europe first people. And so if you fire MacArthur, it's going to be very different than just dispensing with Lloyd Friedendahl or something like that. This is a guy who's very politically connected, and so it's going to matter on many different levels. And that's, of course, also why Roosevelt orders him out of the Philippines, because I think he's concerned it'll be very devastating to morale if MacArthur becomes a POW because of the way he's been built up.
And so he leaves it to Matthew Wainwright instead. Yeah, he's too big, but I mean, you were saying that he makes a whole hash of things when the Japanese attack the Philippines. I mean, talk us through that. I mean, what does he do wrong, and why is it that, like Singapore and Malaya, the Philippines just roll over as well?
So he's had a tough time, even building an army by 1941, and the War Department is desperately pouring in whatever U.S. units they can on the eve of war. And so the American presence has been built up to be about 25% of the manpower, something like that. But the biggest problem he has, the biggest mistake, I would argue, is he dispenses what was called War Plan Orange, which basically said, all right, the Japanese are going to get the jump on us in the Philippines, and they're going to get ashore somewhere. Look at all these islands. Look at all these coasts. We can't defend it all. So what we'll do is we'll retreat to Bataan. We will bleed them there while the fleet comes and fights its way to us in a decisive battle. And then we will, ultimately hang on to Manila and win this war.
And just say, but Bataan is this little kind of peninsula that sort of hangs out opposite the Manila Bay, isn't
exactly.
It? Is that right?
And it's like really a lot of high ground, really good defensible ground. So that makes total sense. But before the war, he decides, no, we're going to defend at the coastline. We're going to be able to just stop the Japanese in their tracks. We don't want them getting Philippine soil. Of course, the army can't begin to do that, and it fails. And so the consequence of this isn't just that you have to adjust and remove your army and fight a different way. The consequence is logistical, because the army's logistical nodes were spread out all over versus concentrated at Bataan. So what that means to you and me as a soldier, we're on half and quarter rations by the time we get to Bataan. So we're never really defeated tactically. The Japanese make a hash of their own in this campaign. They don't fight very well, and they're not all that well led, but the army is just starving. And that means we're devoting most of our time to food.
Well, we talk an awful lot about Schwerpunkts, don't we, and concentration of force, but sometimes you need concentration of defense, don't you?
Yeah, you do. And I think in this case, it would have made total sense, because the Japanese would have had to come after that Phil-American force and neutralize it. Otherwise, they'd never control Manila. And of course, you have Corregidor, too, which is an island that's out in the bay, and that's MacArthur's headquarters. And it's a tough nut to crack, much less these other garrisons that are spread all over the place farther south, like on Mindanao or wherever. I mean, you could argue to this day that no central authority can really control the Philippines. I don't know that the Americans really did as a colonial overseer. The Japanese certainly didn't. And it leads to, of course, a lot of guerrilla operations against them and all that. So there, Jim, you were talking earlier about MacArthur's adjustment. MacArthur really, I think, fixes on to the potency of guerrilla war once these Filipino guerrilla units start to come into play, and some of them have escaped U.S. troops who are part of them, and some don't.
Oh, right, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, MacArthur's headquarters is working very closely with them, by the end of 42 and into 43, as closely as you can, to help supply them, to have communication with them, political support. All of that kind of stuff is going on, and MacArthur's headquarters has taken the lead. And I don't think that that you can look at any other theater command that's quite that deeply involved in irregular operations as was MacArthur's.
Why did he change his plan? Why did he shift?
Because he has this idea that Filipino soil is sacred, that it's defeatist to think about War Plan Orange and just retreating to Bataan and ceding, any of that ground to the Japanese. And as he put it, this is, I hope this analogy lands, but this is the way he put it in an interview with a journalist. He said, "My strategy is hit them where they ain't." So he was using a baseball term, and that's always struck me as like, wait a minute, the very point you're making undoes your whole strategy, because he's trying to say that he's going to hit the Japanese wherever they are somehow. But when you say hit them where they ain't, the Japanese are going to have gaps, and they're going to hit it where you ain't, and they're going to get ashore. So I don't understand what he was talking about there. That was just really odd statement.
And do you think this is okay? So this is partly kind of hubristic. This, all Philippine soil is sacred and all this kind of stuff. But obviously, do you think there's a kind of American or his own personal sense of superiority that the Japanese aren't going to, he's not going to be defeated by the Japanese because they're not going to be good enough? I mean, is there kind of racism there against the Japanese? I mean, why this confidence that he can see them off?
No, I don't think it's necessarily anti-Japanese racism. I think it's overconfidence in his own command and in himself. That MacArthur, can make this sort of grand difference there. But I also do think it is a kind of an allegiance to the Philippines and its people to not abandon what could be millions of them to Japanese occupation, at least for a time. I don't know that MacArthur is psychologically able to accept that. And I really do think that that's a factor there. And he's not a fan of the sort of War Department Washington strategists who he associates with those who have been against him all this time. MacArthur's a very paranoid guy on some levels. And so
I was just going to ask that. Does he fuel a lot of how he feels by being paranoid? Is he driven by what he thinks others think of him and all that sort of stuff? Is that sort of meat to keep him going? Because there are people like that, aren't there? They're all out to get me, and that's where you propel yourself, isn't it? Rather than necessarily your own talents or your own objectives. It's what you perceive your enemies to be, and that these enemies are really the people he's working with rather than the people he's fighting.
Right, and I sometimes joke that I'm not sure who he thought the real enemy was, Washington policymakers or the Japanese. And and so the interesting thing about MacArthur, you've got this monumental ego, and there is a kind of superiority complex on some levels, because he had this sort of eidetic memory, and he was certainly courageous and a fine soldier, but he's just monstrously insecure as a person too, and so you don't often see that. If you're arrogant, usually you don't think of insecurity as part of that, but he is, and so I think that's partly what's driving him throughout the war too.
But it's peculiar because, as you describe, he's got plenty to be arrogant about. I mean,
he does. He's a fine soldier on many levels, and on some levels, he's a really good human being. And what I mean by that, in his personal dealings with people, he's very, very polite, very courtly, very considerate. I don't know if you've ever seen a movie, The Emperor's General, with Tommy Lee Jones as MacArthur.
Well, I've read the book. I read the book that.
The book is fascinating by Jim Webb.
Brilliant. Jim Webb, yeah,
it is.
Who was a Vietnam veteran and wrote Fields of Fire. I don't know if you've read that, which is just absolutely superb book. I think it's a novel.
It's an incredible book. It is a novel based on
his own experiences.
Yeah, Webb was a Marine at I Corps. I think he got the Navy Cross, and it's the book. So The Emperor's General, incredible book.
And wasn't he a sort of assistant secretary to the Navy or something like that?
He was.
Didn't
he was secretary
he had the
of the
same
Navy.
He was secretary of the Navy, was he? Okay.
He was secretary of the Navy under Reagan.
So I met him because in a former life when I was doing book PR, we published The Emperor's General, and I loved that book. I thought it was an amazing novel.
Too.
And he came
It's an
over to the
incredible
UK
book.
to promote. And so I had a kind of a whole week hanging out with Jim Webb, and he was fantastic. But that book is absolutely stunning. But what I remember very clearly about it is, and I've read subsequently, is that relationship with Matthew Wainwright, who's this general who gets effectively sacrificed, isn't he? He's the guy who gets left behind. Someone's got to stay behind. And it's Wainwright, isn't it?
It is Wainwright. Yeah, the other thing before I want to talk about Wainwright before we get into that, the Emperor's General movie, Tommy Lee Jones portrays MacArthur, and if you had tried to sit down and say, let's try and put together the worst portrayal of MacArthur in terms of how he really was, I mean, I don't know how you could have done more. He's got him like throwing F-bombs every other minute. MacArthur hardly ever cursed. It never did. He was just not that way. So the other thing too about Wainwright, they had known each other for a long time. They were both military legacies. Wainwright's father was a soldier. His uncle was a naval officer who was killed fighting pirates. So Wainwright, unlike most West Pointers, has a tribute to him at the Naval Academy and to his uncle. And so Wainwright had been around the Army a long time and was highly respected. And so when MacArthur leaves, he's the overall commander who then has to deal with this mess. And it's just traumatic on so many levels for Jonathan Wainwright.
Yeah.
Well, shall we take a moment then to say that's the end of this first part of maybe two parts. It may sprawl further. Like MacArthur's career, it will return. We will see you next time. Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, Al Murray, John McManus, and James Holland. See you soon.
So long.